Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: China has changed since I was PM, David Cameron tells U.S. audience. New U.S.-Mexico agreement to monitor foreign investments comes as more Chinese money flows into Mexico. Cameron tells U.S. cutting off Ukraine would be gift to Putin. Xi. Blinken explains his reaction to Biden calling Xi a dictator. China sees Europe as key trade partner, Xi tells visiting EU leaders. China has changed since I was PM, David Cameron tells US audience. The Sydney Morning Herald. Former UK Prime Minister David Cameron has called on the US Congress to approve the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, ITAR, and the sale of 3 Virginia-class submarines to Australia as part of the AUKUS Defence Pact. Speaking at the Aspen Security Forum, Cameron acknowledged that China had changed since his time in office and cited the treatment of the Uyghurs in Hong Kong, as well as wolf warrior diplomacy as examples. He also warned that the West's withdrawal from Ukraine would be a Christmas gift for China. New U.S.-Mexico agreement to monitor foreign investments comes as more Chinese money flows into Mexico. Associated Press. The United States and Mexico have agreed to monitor foreign investments and share information about the screening of Chinese investments in Mexico. The move is aimed at preventing Chinese purchases of sensitive American technology that could be accessed through Mexico. China has become the fastest-growing source of foreign investment in Mexico in recent years, prompting concerns about national security risks. The agreement between the U.S. and Mexico reflects the intensifying competition between the two countries and their efforts to protect their respective interests. Cameron tells U.S. cutting off Ukraine would be gift to Putin. Xi. Bloomberg. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron has urged U.S. Congress to approve billions of dollars in support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. Senate Republicans blocked $66 billion in emergency aid to Ukraine, raising concerns that U.S. funding to the war-torn nation will dry up amid a partisan stalemate in Washington. Cameron warned that failure to support Ukraine risked emboldening Russian President Vladimir Putin and would give an advantage to Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. He also stressed that the U.S. aid package would have a huge impact on other European nations' commitment to supporting Ukraine. Blinken explains his reaction to Biden calling Xi a dictator. Politico. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has given a lighthearted excuse for wincing when President Joe Biden called Chinese leader Xi Jinping a dictator. Blinken said that he had a stiff neck after a long day of intense conversations with China. However, Blinken also acknowledged the tension between the U.S. and China, stating that the two countries have very different systems. Biden's comment came after a meeting with Xi aimed at calming fears of military conflict in the Indo-Pacific. China's foreign ministry denounced Biden's remark, calling it extremely wrong and irresponsible political manipulation. China sees Europe as key trade partner, Xi tells visiting EU leaders. South China Morning Post. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has emphasized the importance of Europe as a trade partner, particularly in the fields of technology and supply chains, during a meeting with the presidents of the European Commission and Council. The summit took place amid strained relations between China and Europe, with tensions over issues such as trade practices, Taiwan, and the war in Ukraine. However, both sides sent positive signals during the meeting, with Xi stating that China views the EU as a key partner in trade, technology cooperation, and industrial and supply chain cooperation. The European leaders expressed their desire for a stable and sustainable relationship with China and highlighted areas of potential cooperation, such as trade, the green and digital economies, and global issues like climate change and artificial intelligence. Biden and Xi mend ties. Financial Times. The recent visit to the U.S. by Chinese President Xi Jinping has raised hopes of a more positive relationship between the two countries. However, experts are questioning the stability of this relationship and whether a conflict over Taiwan can be avoided. Gideon Rachman discusses these questions with China experts Evan Medeiros and Jude Blanchett. Thursday Briefing. New York Times. The Israeli military has resumed airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, where more than 2 million people are trapped. The airstrikes have killed over 16,000 people, according to the health ministry. Israel claims that civilian casualties are inevitable because Hamas embeds within Gaza's population. The military is now entering the next phase of its offensive against Hamas, focusing on the south where most of Gaza's population has fled. Israel has told many civilians to move again, but it is not clear where they should go and conditions are desperate. Food and water are scarce, taps have run dry, and UN shelters are overcrowded. The blockade has also severely limited the amount of essential supplies coming into Gaza. Before the war, 500 trucks arrived in Gaza every day, but far fewer have made it across since the bombardment began. The war in Gaza is causing a rift between Arab leaders and their people, as well as between Republicans in Congress and Ukraine. Republicans blocked an emergency spending bill to provide $50 billion in security assistance for Ukraine, demanding strict new restrictions at the U.S. border in exchange. The resistance in Congress reflects a dwindling appetite among Republicans for supporting Ukraine, as polls show that Americans are losing interest in providing financial assistance. Leaders of China and the European Union meet as tensions rise. New York Times. Leaders from the European Union, EU, met with China's top leader, Xi Jinping, during a visit to Beijing on Thursday. They urged China to address trade imbalances and to use its influence over Russia to end the war in Ukraine. The EU has criticized China's refusal to curtail its support for Moscow, and the EU has introduced restrictions on the trade of high-tech products with China. The EU also labels China a strategic rival and is working toward limiting their dependence on Chinese firms, and has called for China to de-risk its supply chains. She tells EU leaders the two sides must work on political trust. Bloomberg. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for the European Union, EU, and China to enhance cooperation and mutual trust. His comments came as EU leaders met with Chinese officials in Beijing for the first in-person summit in 4 years. The EU has been pressing China to address economic frustrations, and the meeting was expected to cover issues such as data flows and market access. EU officials are also expected to ask China to crack down on Moscow's use of banned technologies and goods, which it has been accessing via China. Singapore looks to deepen ties with China during Wang's visit. Bloomberg. China and Singapore are discussing ways to strengthen ties, including a potential mutual visa-free arrangement that would allow citizens from both countries to visit each other without a visa. Talks between Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and China's Vice Premier He Lifeng covered cooperation in areas such as the financial sector and market connectivity. China has been making efforts to boost investor confidence and open up its market since President Xi Jinping met with U.S. President Joe Biden last month. Chinese Premier Li Chang said that China is willing to work with Singapore and other nations on a China-ASEAN free trade area. Wang's visit to China comes amid signs of stabilizing relations between China and the U.S. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your favorite observer from the 6 Degrees world, Dr. Six. Today, we have quite a diverse range of news stories to discuss. From former UK Prime Minister David Cameron's call for the US Congress to approve the sale of submarines to Australia, to the US-Mexico agreement on monitoring Chinese investments, and even a light-hearted excuse from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken for wincing when President Biden called Chinese leader Xi Jinping a dictator. Let's dive in, shall we? First off, David Cameron's speech at the Aspen Security Forum caught my attention. He highlighted the changing nature of China, particularly with regards to its treatment of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and its assertive wolf warrior diplomacy. He warned that the West's withdrawal from Ukraine would be a Christmas gift for China, which is an interesting perspective. It shows how interconnected global politics can be, and how actions in one part of the world can have ripple effects elsewhere. Speaking of Ukraine, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron urged the US Congress to approve emergency aid for Ukraine to counter Russia's aggression. He stressed the importance of supporting Ukraine to avoid giving an advantage to both Putin and Xi Jinping. It's a reminder that geopolitical dynamics are complex and intertwined, and that decisions made by one country can have far-reaching consequences for others. Now, let's lighten the mood a bit with Secretary Blinken's excuse for wincing when President Biden referred to Xi Jinping as a dictator. He blamed it on a stiff neck from intense conversations with China. Ah, the perils of diplomacy. But in all seriousness, Blinken's acknowledgement of the tension between the US and China reflects the reality that these two countries have very different systems and interests. It's a reminder that finding common ground can be challenging, but it's crucial for maintaining stability in the world. Moving on, Chinese leader Xi Jinping emphasized the importance of Europe as a trade partner during a meeting with EU leaders. Despite strained relations, both sides expressed a desire for stable and sustainable cooperation, particularly in areas such as trade, technology, and climate change. It's a reminder that even in the face of challenges, diplomacy and dialogue are essential for finding common ground and moving forward. Lastly, we have news of Israeli airstrikes in Gaza and the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. The situation in Gaza is dire, with food and water shortages, overcrowded shelters, and limited essential supplies. The blockade is exacerbating the humanitarian crisis, and it's a reminder of the devastating impact that conflicts can have on innocent civilians. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but it's important to keep the plight of the people in Gaza at the forefront of our minds. Well, that wraps up our news roundup for today. I hope you enjoyed our journey through these diverse stories. Now, I'd love to hear from you, my wonderful audience. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any questions or insights to share? Let's open the floor for discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.